Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, actually one data point for you all today, and that is 15, as in a 15-point swing towards Donald Trump in this year's election, specifically among voters earning less than $50,000 a year, the poorest block of voters in the United States. That amounts to the first time since the 1960s that a majority of Americans in that low income bracket voted Republican.
Democrats won voters who make more than $100,000, and Republicans, Trump, won voters who make $100,000 or less, and particularly did the best among people who make $50,000 or less.
The promised Trump tariffs will lead to another trade war that will push prices higher and cause the economy nearly 1 million jobs, but low-income voters, who will be the first affected by higher prices and the job losses, still sided with Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election.
So Donald Trump obviously is going to be the next president, leader of the executive branch of the U.S. government. Much less clear exactly is how he's going to be leading the coalition that he's built, the new coalition that the Trump Republican Party represents. In part, that's because it's not really clear how he's going to be chief ideologue of his own administration. Trump doesn't seem to be a terribly ideological figure, famously more interested in short-term advantages in foreign policy and economic policy than any kind of long-term strategic thinking. But he's presiding over a coalition in his own government that's comprised of various different kinds of ideologies. So the meaning of Trumpism will partly be determined by who wins out. Right now, it's just a matter of potential, and we thought we'd try to unpack what that potential is. And yeah, that potential is captured in part in unique voting patterns that we saw this year. It wasn't just that the poor swung towards the Republican Party. It's also that more affluent voters shifted to the Democrats. There was an even larger shift, in fact, among those earning over $100,000 a year to the Democrats. And so I'm curious, Adam, what to make of this working class vote for Trump. I mean, and I guess in a more general sense, what does class politics even mean anymore in this context when it's still the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party comprised of the upper classes that are most in favor of redistribution towards poorer parts of the electorate? I mean, have we entered an era where kind of materialist class analysis of the classic kind has just been turned on its head? Is this the end of class war as we've traditionally understood it in some way?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I mean, I think at the most general level, the issue with materialism and the critics of materialism being the big, grand, metaphysical, almost philosophical idea that it's, what we eat that determines who we are more than what we think. It's realities, it's the means through which and the way in which we reproduce our lives that shapes identities and assumptions about the world, right? That basic premise. The thing about it is that it's so often applied as a means of rather coarse, not to say crude, simplification. This for workers, that for capitalists, and then surprise, surprise, the world doesn't make that much sense if you're trying to apply that. And in this particular case, as you're saying, what are we to make of the fact that better off people seem to be voting for redistribution? It's turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, you might say. Conversely, you have working class voters voting for a business party that's promising to produce huge tax cuts for the ultra wealthy. To my mind, the thing here is that materialism is misunderstood, and if you take it seriously, it's the precise opposite of simplification. It requires an almost infinitely painstaking intention to detail. It's almost like a novelist's attention to detail. And in this particular case, I think we need to just start by recognizing that the very minimum class schema we need to understand American politics right now is a 3-class rather than a 2-class model. I mean, like, one element is an idea of the working class. Let's define that in terms of dependent employment, being working for somebody else. Relatively low incomes, so by all means earning less than the average, so 50,000 or less. and a lack of control at work that goes hand in hand with relatively less credentials, less education. At the other end of the spectrum, there are what you might call the rich people, the upper class, who have not just higher incomes, but wealth and power and the security that goes with that. In the Marxist sense, they may actually literally control the means of production. Big hotel, a factory, a business, or whatever. But you can't understand the politics of the US right now unless you acknowledge that there's a third social class, let's call it the professional managerial class, who are credentialed by the education system, occupy positions of authority within the economy and society at large, and they exercise control directly, often, over working class Americans. And that starts literally at the beginning in kindergarten or elementary school, where you have a college-educated person taking charge of your kid and their kid's education, or taking charge of you yourself and subjecting you to education. And it goes all the way through to the hospitals where your kids are born and your parents die, and the folks that regulate what you can build in your front yard and everything else, right? The entire apparatus of managerialism. And you can see where I'm going with this. Mate, once you've got that three-part schema in place, which is thoroughly materialistic, you can, I think, easily understand the dynamics which are in play here. The stereotypical working class Trump voter admires the man himself, right? He admires, or she admires, the billionaire business person and his cronies. They've done well, and they exercise the privileges of having done well because they're allowed to speak their mind and do their own thing. And above all, what they're allowed to do is flaunt and show disrespect and scorn for the values of the professional middle class, which the rich folks can afford to just spit on, and working class people have to suffer. Right? Trump and co. can say out loud what many ordinary Americans think, which is that they simply can't get with the highfalutin ideas of everyone from the school teacher to the librarian all the way up to the fancy Ivy League professor and the folks on television who want to talk about, complex norms of transgendered identities or structural racism or climate change, these big, abstract, difficult concepts. And yet, what the working class observer will point out is that it's not actually those people in the final analysis who call the shots, and the people who do are the people like Trump, and those are the people that you kind of admire. And if somebody like that is willing to just shoot their mouth and speak their mind and say whatever they like, and it turns out to be a relatively conservative message, then this plays extremely well with that working class constituency. And this is not anti-materialist or a refusal of materialism. It's a very specific set of resentments deeply embedded in the actual existence of many working class Americans every day of the week. And if you start from there, what is difficult to understand about the fact that working class men are not keen to vote for fancy, high-powered lawyer ladies as candidates of the Democratic Party? There's just nothing to my mind that strikes me as surprising about this at all, right? It adds, and the appeal, or the distaste, is compounded by the fact that fancy lawyer lady is treating Trump as though he's a buffoon. And one of her most successful punchlines in the campaign to the New York Times reading class is, "I'm speaking now," right? Which is this sort of maternal assertion of power de haut en bas towards whoever it is as being, supposed to shut up at that point. In this case, it was a heckler, but it expresses something that working class Americans will find easy to relate to, but in a negative way. I mean, is it really surprising that white women without college degrees preferred Trump over Hillary and then Harris by a margin of 25 to 28%? I struggle to understand why anyone finds this surprising. Imagine a middle school class, and imagine there's two people throwing a party, and one of them is like the state champion spelling bee girl, and the other one is a high-living frat boy who appears to know how to have a good time. Where would you expect the less academically ambitious girls in the class? Which party do you expect them to go to, right? So the very fact that American liberals find this so hard to digest, to the point at which they begin to question their own metaphysical assumptions, to my mind is an expression of the extraordinary profoundly material divides there are in US society that literally render the behavior of one group almost incomprehensible to the people who supposedly understand everything, right? The liberal educated group. And one of the reasons why we can't see this incredibly obvious, incredibly powerful three-way split is that it's very badly captured by the statistics that we have to rely on. It's really appalling how inadequate the sociological data are on American elections. We basically, what do we have to do? We have to rely on two categories to do almost all the work. One is college versus non-college, and the other one is 50K, 50 to 100K, 100K plus, as though these were adequate categories for describing the complex reality of American society. I mean, it's telling that even if you just combine those two elements, you end up with something quite informative, which is that amongst men without college degrees, there is a huge propensity to vote Trump amongst those with over 100K in income. Because, just imagine the novelistic character here. This is the small business owner who didn't go to college and nevertheless has made good, and therefore knows very well that folks like Harris or Clinton are just a huge pain in the arse lawyer lady that they want to have absolutely nothing to do with, right? And so there's this scornful rejection of those values, firmly rooted in materialism, translated into a cultural politics of mutual scorn and contempt, which have very, very deep roots in American society in this current moment. So I think materialism is all the way. It gives us all the juice that we need, but we need a more refined, complex, richer understanding of these social, economic, and cultural hierarchies.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you're emphasizing here the symbolic benefits, with the material basis, but the symbolic benefits that are reaped from one side winning and the other side losing from the perspective of the working class. I'm curious if this analysis, if we were to filter it through specifically the material benefits that the working class stands to gain one way or the other. And I'm curious, I guess more specifically, whether something's been revealed here about the kinds of egalitarianism that working class voters want. I'm thinking here about the debate that one sometimes sees referenced between redistribution and pre-distribution. And, redistribution is the more traditional policy, I guess, that we're used to seeing in the context of U.S. liberalism, basically encourage overall economic growth and then take some of the proceeds in the form of taxes and then distribute that in the form of benefits, whether subsidies for health insurance or child tax credits, et cetera. And then pre-distribution, on the other hand, would be kind of this idea that the state should try to prevent inequalities from occurring in the first place. And it struck me that a crackdown on immigration could theoretically be described in that way. In fact, was described in that way on the campaign. Lowering competition for jobs, housing, lowering taxes itself could be described in that way, I guess. Keeping more of what you earn. So does this amount to a rejection of redistribution in favor of pre-distribution? And I don't know, can U.S. liberalism even accommodate this? Does pre-distribution involve more directly addressing political questions of power and institutions rather than just sort of accepting the legitimacy of the existing institutions that exist?
I mean, I think this is a very, very interesting point indeed. To just double down on the idea, there's a very interesting interview with Brad DeLong, I think, for the Nick Sannen Center, which is one of the more bipartisan think tanks in DC, where he says, they quote him writing in 2023, neoliberalism's big problem was that it starved society of long-term investment, both in productivity enhancing technology and in the vast majority of people. Social democracy's problem was that most people did not want to be passive recipients of government benefits. Rather, they wanted the social power to earn and hence to deserve their slice of the growing pie. He goes on to say that the people in West Virginia and Tennessee that vote 70% for Donald Trump do not want to be Medicaid recipients. They want a strong economy in which they can earn what they deserve and so be able to stand on their feet and buy health insurance. And I think that's a powerful way of thinking about the appeal of a non-state-centered, non-governmentally centered project that embraces the vast majority of the population in a general view of uplift. I think it's, not without reason, as I was sort of suggesting in the first answer, that ultimately the social ideal of many of the Trump working class voters is self-employment, because self-employment gives you the means to both assert independence, to break out of the constraints, which are very material as well as cultural, of the professional middle class and its assumptions about norms and values. And they put you in a position to be able to afford nice private health insurance for you and all the members of your family. The question is how you get there for everyone. And obviously, self-employment is not an option for everyone in the American working class. But it's very interesting to see both, I think, liberal, as I think we will call them in the American context, and conservative thinkers like Oren Cass, who's the chief economist of American Compass, increasingly moving towards positions which actually validate the strength of trade unions and push for models like sectoral bargaining, where entire sectors or entire regions of the country will negotiate fair wages and the sort of wages that will ensure that American families can, in fact, achieve that ideal of robust independence whilst being in employment. I mean, that I think is in many ways the sort of high-flown ideal, the high-flown version of the Trump project. It's an idea, you could put it this way, of saying, well, trade unions are great. What we don't like about trade unions is when they adopt all of the liberal positions beyond the basic material bargain, because the idea actually would be, by way of a better material bargain, to allow people to freely express whatever political opinions they have, which the conservatives gamble would actually be conservative if people had the chance and felt, that they had the material means necessary to free themselves from various types of societal constraint. It's an entirely, it's a very particular construction of the afflictions of American society in the current moment. I'm not sure that, I think liberalism can certainly deal with this, but it's a sort of social liberalism. It's an old school pluralist, corporatist liberalism that recognized societal forces as key players and didn't expect all of the solutions to come from government agencies, tax-funded agencies, but absolutely did expect social bargains at the workplace to establish a fair baseline from which then, the majority of people could hope to enjoy a decent standard of living.
Yeah, I guess that also presupposes some conflict, right? I mean, the bargains are sort of presuppose a lack of pre-consensus. But to shift to how this all works out in the Trump coalition itself, I'm curious if there are, contradictions within the various wings of the new Trump party. On one hand, there is Trumpism's national protectionist wing with emphasis on raising tariffs, perhaps to the point of trade wars, cutting immigration. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of libertarian style wing that's maybe more associated with Silicon Valley and even reminiscent of the kind of Malay-style governance of the Malay presidency of Argentina, emphasizing cutting government, even perhaps looser immigration, maybe even more free trade. And so I'm curious whether these wings can be reconciled and how we could tell which one has the upper hand in the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting question. One might pick up your comment just now and say it's a question of where they locate the main conflict, right? So, he's appointed Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy as they're going to head this outfit, which is the Department of Government Efficiency, which not coincidentally spells out as Doge, which is one of the coins that Elon Musk has been keen on. And they, I think, are pursuing this sort of slash red tape, slash government bureaucracy, remove all the things which are preventing me from colonizing Mars, that kind of vision on the Elon Musk type. So there you might say the chief conflict is being located in a clash between the productive entrepreneurial forces of American society and the parasitic public sector, which is bloated and needs to be stripped back, right? So that's one way of thinking of the conflict. Another key appointment that Trump has already made, and they're moving quite swiftly, to make appointments in a concerted way, quite contrast with the first time round. Still, I don't think we know how these conflicts are going to play out, but let's just look at, the cards which are, in people's hands and what's been dealt. So there's the libertarian side. The national protectionist wing, I think, is most powerfully represented by some of the appointments which have been made in the national security space. Think of Rubio's nomination as Secretary of State. He is an ultra China hawk. But then in trade policy, you have Robert Lighthizer, who was for so long, the attorney of the U.S. steel industry that was U.S. trade representative in the first Trump administration. And he displaces the key conflict from inside American society to outside, right? Lighthizer is a sort of socially solidaristic vision of American society, but wants to wage trade war against the Chinese. But significantly, Lighthizer was not promoted from his role in the first Trump administration. This may be simply because Trump rates him as a trade technocrat, and he clearly is America's leading trade technocrat. I think at this point it's fair to say, as a policy guy, he earned a lot of respect even from the Democrats in the way he handled trade policy in the first Trump administration. But Trump didn't see fit to promote him to, Commerce Secretary, let alone Treasury Secretary. And for Treasury Secretary, he's looking at Wall Street types. And the guy who seems to be most squarely in the spotlight is this guy Besant from Key Square Capital Management, and he just strikes one as being a fairly typical deregulating, business guy who, when push comes to shove, is almost tempted to say that he thinks that Trump's instincts are free trading. And so, there's a real blend there. And that's also the impulse that we're getting from the conservative judges on the Supreme Court. So there's a kind of a three-way, I think, conflict going on here between the folks that are truly libertarian, kind of rather radical thinkers of the transition. There are people who are in this national defense solidaristic position. And then there's, I think, a rather old school business wing that just sees this as a vehicle for doing the usual, existing corporate interests will be defended in various ways. And I think all three of those are contending for influence in the Trump administration right now.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Trumpist economics. So if we were to take specifically a look at the potential protectionist policies that will be put into place, I mean, how intense could this all get? I mean, and who would the main victims then be?
So, I mean, the benchmarks we've had from the campaign, and everyone right now is just trying to puzzle this through and figure it out. And the short answer is we don't know. But what has been mentioned is a blanket tariff of 10% or possibly 20% on all of America's foreign trade. And then more specifically, a 60% tariff on Chinese trade. What we don't know is whether this is just a plan and it won't actually go anywhere, whether this is actually a matter of negotiation. So whether you slap this tariff on with a view to negotiating with foreign partners, or indeed, as you suggested in one of your great questions recently, whether this is really just a way of opening the door to corruption at home. We don't know who exactly is going to be, calling the shots in the inside lobbying that will go on when it gets down to business. As your question prompted me to dig into, like Apple's maneuvering, for instance, was very significant. We don't know how other countries will react to America's tariff moves. And we actually, at a kind of basic level of modeling, don't really know what happens. I mean, we don't have we have some general ideas in economic theory, but we don't really of late have the experience of the sort of scale of trade protectionist shock that would be implied by sticking 60% tariffs on $500 billion worth of Chinese imports to the United States. Economists will venture a guess and we will think it's going to be pretty bad, but we don't know exactly how bad or how it's going to work. And this is very complex. I mean, US trade is shaped by tariffs on about 6,000 different products with 200 different countries. If you were really going to do a blanket trade policy move, it's important to emphasize just how radical that would be if you were really going to apply a 10% or 20% tariff. The Chinese bit is in some senses the more conventional side because we've been through that rigmarole before, but a blanket tariff really changes the terms of practically everyone's activity. And it's not even clear for that where the legislative authority would come from. There's, a bunch of legislation from the 1970s which has been conventionally invoked. It's not altogether clear whether Congress would stand by to allow that to be used to provide a universal tariff. And there's also the possibility of an appeal to the Supreme Court, which might or might not yield, pushback. They've generally been fairly compliant on trade policy. I mean, one expert that was quoted in the ST said, "We're in that time of life in international trade where strange incredulity is maybe the order of the day." But to avoid, to just stop beating around the bush and give some concrete answers, because this really is a situation of unparalleled uncertainty. The previous experience shows that the basic Trump promise that you stick a tariff on and a foreigner pays is bogus, right? All of the econometric evidence from the last round of tariffs under the first Trump presidency showed that what actually happened is that the tariff was passed on to American consumers. Foreign producers did not eat it, did not put it in their profit margin. When you pose the tariff, what they do is they simply pass it on to consumers. What we therefore know is that this will hit hard the worst off consumers in the United States. And estimates from existing economic modeling suggest that it would be in the order of a $1,500 to $2,000 tax on every household in the US per annum, which for the lower half of the income distribution could amount to as much as a 3.5% to 4% income tax for them specifically. So this is regressive. And if it was used to replace or fund income tax cuts, it would be doubly regressive because you'd be using a regressive tax to finance a further regressive tax cut. And furthermore, there is really very little evidence to believe that it will rapidly stimulate employment or economic growth or productivity or all of that good stuff in the American economy. They're really, insofar as we have economic models for this, and folks like Lighthizer and Michael Pettis and the other defenders of tariffs will say, oh, well, in American history in the 19th century, tariffs were important for driving industrial and economic growth. That's a story which has a historical warrant when the United States was in a very different position from the one it's in today. I don't think there's very much econometric evidence. In other words, our best empirical knowledge of how modern economies function that will bear out that kind of an answer, certainly in the politically relevant period of the next couple of years. Maybe over the very long run, it would shift the balance. But to a considerable extent, this is going to be simply a tax on American consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I also saw a study that shows that the companies that benefit, the domestic companies, ultimately become less efficient as a result of this kind of protection.
As you would expect, right? Nothing surprising there.
Yeah. But, I guess to shift from some of these speculative questions, one economic event that has already taken place since the election is a spike in the value of the US dollar. And to some extent, based on what I've read, that's based on precisely this tariff policy that the Trump administration says it would put into place. That's led to a higher dollar as people imagine some kinds of inflationary effects and the central bank responding to those in turn. And so, first of all, I'm curious, how high could the dollar really go here? And second of all, does the Trump team really understand this causality, that tariffs could lead to a higher dollar, even though Trump's preferred policy is a devalued dollar? So how does that shake out?
Yeah, it's super complicated. And this goes to this element of us not really knowing what a world looks like in which you shock hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of trade with substantial tariffs. But yeah, we would expect all of these feedback loops. I mean, they're quite tricky because the narrative that you just mentioned, if there were indeed higher prices in the US, that would tend, in fact, to devalue the dollar. So it's only if you imagine that by way of the higher prices and the Fed's response to those higher prices that you get higher interest rates in the United States, that this works. Maybe the best way to spell this out for our patient listeners is to differentiate two different types of effects, trade and the capital account, and then to look at it to start with from the trade point of view, from the point of view not of the United States, but of the people it trades with. So say you're China, and there is a 60% tariff on your exports to the United States, on which your economy doesn't depend. China is a huge economy, but nevertheless it hurts. And it gives you the excuse to do what? Well, it gives you the excuse to think hard about the current value of your exchange rate. And unlike other exchange rates, the Chinese exchange rate, the yuan exchange rate or renminbi exchange rate is to a considerable extent under the influence of the authorities because they have capital account controls and they intervene regularly. So how would you respond if you were Beijing and your exporters were suddenly hit with this huge tax? Well, the risk, of course, is they become uncompetitive. So one of the things you'll be tempted to do is to reduce the value of your exchange rate relative to the dollar. And whether the Americans like it or not, that's a revaluation of the dollar in the upward direction and a devaluation of a major trading partner's currency, right? So that's one side of this. And when that happens, what it does is to offset the anti-competitive effect of the tariff in the United States for the Chinese goods, because they now come in on this more competitive exchange rate. And of course, conversely, what it does is to hit America's capacity to export. And this isn't even talking about the retaliatory tariffs which the Chinese will undoubtedly impose on American goods and wait to see the way in which the American agricultural lobby, notably the soy producers, squeal when this unfolds, because China for them is a really important market. There aren't that many American exporters for whom China is an important market, but agriculture is one, right? So that's one logic. America imposes a trade penalty on foreigners trying to import to the United States. And so they respond. And in the Chinese case, it could be a deliberate policy by lowering the value of their exchange rate. If it's not a deliberate policy, in other cases, it will simply follow from the logic of saying, if you export less, your currency in the due course will become less valuable. And so if the policy works, it counteracts itself. And then on top of this, there is another line which runs by way of the capital account, which is the one that you were invoking when you were talking about the Fed policy. So say there is a price shock in the United States from the trade policy effect, then the Fed will have to respond to that to contain inflation by raising interest rates, or it'll feel compelled to do so. And when the Fed raises interest rates, what it does is to suck foreign funds into the United States, because people want to invest in American assets with higher interest rates, and that drives the dollar up. Another effect of a similar line would be to say, if the idea of a protectionist policy is to persuade people to produce goods in the United States, what do they have to do that? They have to invest. And so money that previously might have gone into foreign direct investment in other countries from platforms from which to sell into the United States now goes into the United States. Again, what we get is an effect by which foreigners want dollars to invest, right? Overall, this then leads people like Michael Pettis, the noted economist who's based in Beijing and is a regular critic and commentator on these issues, to say, you know, what we actually need to do is control the inflow of foreign money into the United States, because it's that which chronically dries up the value of the dollar and makes American manufacturing increasingly uncompetitive. So either then, to spell out your scenario, we have a clash between the Trump administration and the Fed, where the Fed is responding to inflationary pressures in the United States by raising interest rates, or we have a clash between the Trump government and Wall Street if they were to even think about going down the route of taxing foreign funds flowing into the United States. This is not a internally consistent policy in its current formulation, and the way that it looks right now does indeed lead to a whole mass of contradictions from which one can infer a whole bunch of scenarios about different types of political clash that might unfold. That's the drama that we're going to be watching in the next 4 years.
Well, then finally, to turn to one of the other big planks in the Trump platform, namely immigration, and then more specifically, deportation. I'm curious about the economics involved in a big push for deportation of immigrants in the United States. And first of all, I guess, what are the direct costs involved? I'm thinking here about, spending more on security forces necessary to round people up, setting up camps to house people before they get deported, even maybe bribing countries to take migrants back. And then more broadly, the macroeconomic effects of this kind of deportation push, could this in itself fuel inflation in the United States, and in what ways?
Yeah, this is really a sordid story, because there is an interaction between the Immigration Customs Enforcement authorities, ICE, that are responsible under the Homeland Security Department for border enforcement, detention and deportation, and private business. And it's a story that goes back to the 2000s and the 2010s. There's a couple of firms. The two that stand out are Geogroup and Core Civic, that started out as private prison providers, and then as politics moved against private provision, and in fact banks became unwilling to finance them, they moved increasingly into the less politically sensitive area of migration management and detention of undocumented arrivals in the United States. They are medium-sized big businesses. They have turnovers of a few billion. Half of that, in the case of Geogroup, comes from contracts with ICE. They operate facilities that are able to house tens of thousands of people collectively. They also operate a variety of enhanced surveillance systems, which are ways of monitoring undocumented migrants without confining them to prison-like detention centers. And they are really just in an absolutely wildly ecstatic state right now. On the so-called earnings calls, this is when the firms get on the phone with investor analysts. They're talking about, Geo Group was built for this unique moment in our history and the opportunities that it will bring, is the quote from the CEO days after Trump's election. So there really is a direct connection here between the interests of particular businesses and this punitive agenda of deportation. From an economic point of view, every liberal in the United States, and by that I mean a market liberal, should be screaming about the implications of this, because it's estimated that about 8 million undocumented workers supply a key component of the US workforce. That's 5-6%. It's difficult to be too precise about this workforce for obvious reasons. They play a very, very important part in the construction workforce, the low-end service sector, and in parts of manufacturing. And if you take that out, it's a giant supply shock to the American economy. Now, to be fair to the Trump people, the idea is to deliver that supply shock, and then what you hope for is an adjustment in wages, which in turn then pulls some fraction of the currently underemployed American working class, and particularly men that we're thinking of here, into the American workforce and offsets. But the balance of workers and the choices of employment that they're in are, deeply entrenched social equilibria. Collective decisions by millions and millions of people structure who works and what they work for and where they work and how they live. And the idea that by a violent program of deportation, the model appears to be the ghastly wetback program of the Eisenhower era, so-called. This is one of the pejorative racialized slurs that are used against Mexican workers in the United States. This seems to have been the model that deported 1.3 million people. Vance and co seem to like the idea of deporting 1 million a year. The consequence of that is basically a series of rolling shocks to a large part of the US economy. It will, again, drive wages and prices up. This might be to the benefit of some American workers, but the price effect will be felt across the US economy. It will interrupt production, and you could say, fine, we want that because we want to squeeze very low-end wage and productivity out of the US economy. But if that's the project, why not start with investment rather than this strategy of punitive deportation? And as if to confirm this, Geo Group recently found itself being ordered by a state of Washington Supreme Court to pay millions of dollars in compensation to the detainees that it had kept in its camps. And it had been paying them $1 a day to do laundry, wash dishes, run the barber shop, operate the library in a state where the minimum wage is $16 per hour. And the court ordered the prison of this detention corporation itself to pay compensation and offer those workers the minimum wage. So you there, I think, at some point see the sort of brutal commercial logic of private detention facilities eating itself, with a liberal American court intervening to say this is outrageous, it's a violation of local work norms, and these people should be paid in the same way as other workers in the United States at the time. If you're going to employ them, if these are the people that you choose to employ doing this kind of low-end service work, then they should be paid the minimum wage. And that's obviously what a progressive politics of leveling up would look like. It would not consist of a punitive and racialized discrimination, disenfranchisement, and expulsion of foreign workers in the US. It would look to ensure that everyone, whether documented or undocumented, was being paid at least the minimum wage and offer paths to legalization to everyone currently in the United States. This is, after all, as we discussed in our live blog, a population that is disproportionately active in the workforce, that disproportionately contributes to production relative to the existing population of the US. And so in every way is earning its keep and contributing to American society in the broadest possible sense.
Goodness, yeah. Here we find ourselves talking about the economics of military camps housing millions potentially in the United States. Pretty grim stuff. But yeah, such is the content of Trumpist economics. Probably not the last time we'll be talking about this general subject, but we do need to stop here for now. So yeah, see you all again next week.
Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rosbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.